They told him his service no longer mattered. At 40 years old, a decorated
This is the
veteran was
world
quietly
before
pushed
everything
out,
changes.
erased by paperwork and silence. With nothing left but his canine partner and a worn-out truck, he drove north into one of the coldest places in America, where winter doesn't forgive mistakes. When the power failed, when the storm took lives, when the town ran out of heat, one place stayed warm, built into the earth, ignored by everyone, until it saved them all. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Duluth, Minnesota, did not welcome strangers softly. It greeted them the way the big lake did, without apology, with wind that found every seam in your clothing and worried it open. Lake Superior lay out there like a sheet of hammered steel, dull and endless, throwing cold back into the streets. The sky hung low and colorless. Even in late autumn, the air tasted like snow that hadn't arrived yet, but already owned the town. Ethan Crow drove into it with his headlights on at 3 in the afternoon, because daylight in Duluth could be that weak, present but unwilling to commit. A thin glaze of ice shone on the asphalt. Salt crusted the curbs. The bare maples along the hillside looked like black veins against the gray. He kept both hands on the wheel, not because the road was hard, but because letting go felt like permission to drift. On the passenger seat sat a manila envelope, bent at one corner from being opened and closed too many times. The official seal had torn unevenly. Inside was the letter that had folded his life in half, a discharge, effective immediately. Not the kind that came with ceremony or a handshake. The kind that arrived with clipped language and polite signatures. The kind that said, "For the good of the unit," while refusing to name what had actually happened. Ethan was 40, broad-shouldered in a way that made door frames feel narrow with the density of someone built for carrying weight. His hair was dark brown, cut close and already thinning slightly at the crown, as if his body had decided it didn't need decoration. A short, disciplined beard shadowed his jaw. He kept it because shaving felt like effort for an audience that no longer existed. His nose had a slight bend that suggested an old break. Under his eyes sat the faint bruised color of fatigue that sleep didn't erase. People who passed him in a gas station might have pegged him as a construction foreman or a tired father. They wouldn't have guessed he'd learned to listen for danger in silence, or that his anger was less explosive than it was structural, something that reinforced him from the inside, making him harder to move. In the back seat, occupying the space like a quiet promise, was Rook. Rook was a working dog even when he wasn't working. He was 6 years old, a Belgian Malinois with a lean, athletic frame, tawny coat, and a black mask that made his eyes look sharper than they were. His ears stood tall and alert, but his gaze was steady, not frantic. There was an old scar along the ridge of his right shoulder, white fur that didn't match the rest, evidence of a life that had involved more than fetch. When Ethan slowed for a stoplight, Rook shifted his weight and watched the world through the window as if cataloging it. The distance between strangers, the speed of traffic, the flicker of a pedestrian's hands. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply observed, because observation had been their shared language. The letter had come after a chain of small events that had looked harmless on paper. Ethan had questioned a report, one paragraph, one number that didn't add up, one adjustment that made an operation look cleaner than it was. He'd pushed for clarification. That push turned into a label. Not disloyal, not incompetent, worse, inconvenient, the kind of man who made meetings longer. The kind of man who didn't know when to swallow a truth for the sake of morale. He'd tried to do it the right way. Internal channels, formal wording, controlled tone. But institutions didn't always punish anger. Sometimes they punished precision. The day he cleaned out his locker, a few people had avoided eye contact. One had clasped his shoulder and said, "You'll land on your feet," the way you spoke to someone you assumed would never come back. Another, a younger guy Ethan had trained, had walked past without speaking, jaw tight, as if silence was protection. Only one message came through later that night, a text from an old teammate who never wasted words. "Don't come back here. Not now. Let it cool." So Ethan didn't come back. He drove north instead, away from familiar roads and the pity that would follow him like exhaust. He wasn't running, he told himself that. He was choosing distance. There was a difference. Duluth offered him anonymity. It also offered him winter. He pulled into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind with doors that opened straight to the outside and curtains that smelled faintly of smoke no matter what. The sign buzzed with a broken O, making the place look perpetually unfinished. At the desk stood a woman in her late 50s with a soft, round face and dyed auburn hair pulled into a clip. Her name tag read Linda in block letters. She looked at Ethan the way someone looked at a problem they'd seen before, quietly, with a mental list of possible outcomes. "You staying long?" she asked, voice flat with routine. "A couple weeks," Ethan said. Linda's eyes flicked to the back seat. "Dog?" "He's trained." "Quiet!" Linda pursed her lips. She didn't ask what kind of training. She didn't need to. "No trouble," she said, as if it was a rule, not a request. "No barking. No incidents." "No incidents," Ethan repeated. Rook sat, still as a statue. Only his tail tip moved once, a restrained tap against the seat as if acknowledging the agreement. The room was small, 2 beds with stiff floral quilts, a heater that rattled like something trapped inside the wall, and a window that looked out on a parking lot glazed with ice. Ethan unpacked without ceremony. 1 duffel bag, a folded blanket, a small kit of tools that looked too carefully arranged to belong to a man who'd just lost everything. He set Rook's metal bowl near the bathroom door. Rook sniffed the corners, then lay down where he could see both the entrance and Ethan's face. That night, the wind rose. Duluth's wind didn't just blow, it hunted. It slid under the door and made the curtains breathe. Somewhere outside, a loose sign clanged at irregular intervals. Ethan lay on the bed in his clothes, boots on the floor within reach, the discharge letter on the bedside table like a paperweight. He stared at the ceiling and listened. When the sound came, distant, metallic, a sharp snap like something dropped, his body reacted before his mind could label it. His heart jumped once, hard. His breath stopped halfway in. The room narrowed. Rook lifted his head instantly, not frantic, focused. He rose, padded to the bed, and put his front paws on the mattress with controlled pressure, bringing his face close to Ethan's. His eyes weren't asking for reassurance. They were offering it. Ethan exhaled, slow, and laid a hand on the dog's neck. The fur there was warm, real, present. His fingers found the worn edge of Rook's collar and held. "It's just a sign," Ethan murmured, not because Rook needed the words, but because he did. Rook huffed softly, a sound like agreement. By morning, frost filmed the inside of the motel window. Ethan stood watching it as the weak light bled into the room. He didn't think about going back. He didn't think about arguing. He thought about what came next, because thinking about the past was like pressing on a bruise to confirm it still hurt. Outside, the town moved on. Cars crawled the icy streets, people bundled in layers. The lake lay there, cold and indifferent, promising that whatever Ethan built here, whatever life he tried to assemble, would have to be honest. No slogans, no comforting lies. Just structure. Just survival. He looked down at Rook, who was already sitting by the door, ready, eyes bright but steady. Ethan reached for his coat, heavier than the one he'd worn in warmer states, and felt the weight of it settle across his shoulders. "All right," he said. Rook's ears angled forward. Ethan opened the door to the wind, and the wind hit him like a test. Morning in Duluth arrived without warmth. The light was thin and bluish, stretched flat across the parking lot like it had been wrung out of the sky rather than poured from it. Ethan Crow stepped outside the motel with Rook at his heel and felt the cold tighten around his lungs. It wasn't the dramatic cold people talked about, the kind that made headlines. This was the everyday kind, the kind that settled in quietly and stayed long enough to rearrange your habits. He liked that about it. You didn't survive Duluth by pretending. They walked toward the bluff above town where the streets thinned and the houses spaced themselves farther apart, as if even buildings needed room to breathe. Rook moved ahead by half a step, leash loose, body alert but unhurried. His coat caught the light, tawny fur against the frost-dark ground, and his breath rose in steady white plumes. 6 years old, lean and tight as braided rope, he looked younger when he moved. Only the scar along his shoulder and the way his eyes measured distance betrayed how much he'd already lived. Ethan had a plan, though he hadn't named it yet. He knew only what he wasn't going to do. He wasn't going to take another job that asked him to lie politely. He wasn't going to put roots down in a place that required permission to exist. What he wanted was ground, literal ground, something that answered to gravity and weather instead of committees. The listing had been a footnote on a community board at the public library, pinned between a flyer for snowshoe rentals and a notice about a town hall meeting. Land for sale, cheap, outskirts, and cash only, no utilities. The address led to a dirt road that curved away from the last plowed street and climbed toward a low ridge overlooking a narrow, ice-locked creek. The road itself was rutted and frozen into a series of hardened waves. Ethan parked at the edge and walked the rest. The land revealed itself slowly. The slope faced south, not dramatically, just enough to catch what little sun winter offered. A line of scrub pines huddled along the crest, their needles rattling softly in the wind. The ground underfoot was a mix of stone and packed earth, dry even now, with signs of runoff etched like faint handwriting where snowmelt had once traveled. Ethan stopped and listened. No traffic, no voices, just the low sound of the creek moving under ice somewhere below. Rook sat without being told, ears pricked, bored gaze scanning the tree line. When he turned his head toward the slope, Ethan followed the line of his attention and saw what Rook had already clocked. Shelter. The way the hill folded inward slightly, the way the earth seemed to offer its shoulder to anyone willing to lean into it. "You see it too," Ethan said quietly. Rook's tail thumped once. The seller arrived late, boots crunching up the path, breath loud in the cold. His name was Walt Dorsey, a retired logger who looked like he'd been assembled out of spare parts from different decades. He was tall but slightly bowed, as if years of carrying weight had taught his spine to anticipate it. A gray beard framed his mouth, trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity, and his face was cut with lines that didn't bother to soften when he smiled. His eyes were sharp, pale blue. Duran amused in a way that suggested he'd already decided what kind of man Ethan was. "Didn't think you'd show," Walt said by way of greeting. His voice had the gravelly steadiness of someone who'd spent a lifetime shouting over machinery and weather. "I'm here," Ethan replied. Walt snorted. "Most folks don't stay once they see it. Too much wind, no hookups, snow piles up like it's personal." Ethan walked the slope while Walt talked. He knelt, dug his fingers into the soil, felt the way it held together. Not clay-heavy, not loose. It had memory. He pictured lines that didn't exist yet, a cut into the hill, a roof that leaned instead of fought, space that didn't beg to be heated but cooperated. Walt watched him with interest. "You planning on building?" he asked. "Yes." "Cabin?" "Something like that." Walt scratched his beard. "You know folks up here build up, not in. Wood frames, big stoves." "I know." "And you're still looking at the dirt like it owes you something." Ethan stood and met Walt's eyes. "I'm looking at it like it doesn't." That earned a short bark of laughter. "You're not from around here." "No." Walt's gaze flicked to Rook. "Dog's seen things." "Yes." They stood there in the cold, two men measuring each other without pretense. Walt named a price that was low enough to be insulting if Ethan had been someone who needed convincing. Ethan counted out the cash from his jacket pocket, bills stiff with cold. The transaction was quick, almost anticlimactic. No handshake, just a nod. As Walt turned to leave, he paused. "You planning on wintering here?" "Yes." Walt's mouth twisted into something like a smile. "Then you're either smarter than most, or you'll learn fast." He glanced back at the slope. "If you freeze, don't say nobody warned you." When he was gone, the silence returned, heavier now for having been interrupted. Ethan let it settle. He took out a notebook and began to sketch, not blueprints, not yet. Lines of thought, angles, airflow, places where water would want to go and places it shouldn't. He wasn't alone for long. The crunch of tires on frozen dirt announced another arrival, this one more deliberate. A woman stepped out of a mud-splattered pickup and approached with careful footing. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail and a face that carried both curiosity and restraint. Her coat was practical, her boots scuffed. She held a rolled set of papers under one arm like a shield. "I'm Maya Hart," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I work with the county on sustainable builds. Walt called this in, said someone was buying the useless hill." Ethan took her in quickly. She had the posture of someone used to being listened to, but not demanding it. Her eyes moved constantly, not nervously, but analytically, reading slope, tree line, sky. "It's not useless," Ethan said. Maya's mouth curved. "That depends on how honest you are with it." She unrolled one of the papers, maps, elevation lines, water tables. "You thinking conventional?" "No," that got her attention. "Unconventional how?" Ethan pointed to the hill. "Earth-sheltered, partial. The ground's doing half the work." Maya studied him for a long moment. You know, most people don't understand ventilation well enough to pull that off." "I do." "From where?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at Rook, who had moved to sit beside Maya's boots, calm and watchful. "Experience." Maya nodded slowly. "Experience can be good, or it can get people killed." "I'm careful," she almost smiled. "Careful isn't the same as prepared." She tapped the papers. "If you're serious, you'll need to think about moisture, carbon monoxide, drainage. I can't sign off on anything, but I can point out where people usually fail." Ethan met her gaze. "I won't ignore that." Maya rolled the papers back up. "Then I won't ignore you." She glanced at Rook. "He'll need space." "He'll have it." She left him with a card and a look that was half warning, half respect. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped again, the sky bruising purple at the edges. Ethan walked the boundary of the land with Rook, marking points with small stones. The motel room felt farther away already, like a place he'd stayed once in another life. At the crest of the hill, he stopped. From here, he could see the town below, smoke rising thin and constant, every chimney working hard against the cold. He imagined a winter night, wind screaming off the lake, houses burning wood like it was a race they were losing. He imagined something quieter here, something that didn't fight the season but absorbed it. Rook leaned into his leg, solid and warm. "We'll make it work," Ethan said. The hill didn't answer. It didn't need to. It was already there, waiting. The hill did not give itself up all at once. It resisted in small, honest ways, the bite of frozen soil against a shovel blade, the dull complaint in Ethan Crow's shoulders when he lifted stone after stone, the way the wind slid down the slope and found his neck no matter how he turned. This was work that refused shortcuts. Ethan respected that. He had learned long ago that anything worth trusting demanded time and friction. He moved out of the motel 3 days after buying the land, not because the room was intolerable, but because it no longer made sense. The hill required presence. He pitched a low canvas wall tent near the base of the slope, tucked where the trees broke the wind. Inside, he laid a pallet of scrapboards and his old field blanket. Rook inspected the tent once, circled twice, and chose a spot by the entrance where he could see both the creek and the cut of sky above the ridge. Even resting, the dog tracked the world. 6 years old, muscles lean and defined, his coat thickening for winter, Rook had the quiet intensity of something bred to solve problems without applause. Ethan began by marking the cut. He used string and stakes, not because he lacked better tools, but because they forced him to think in lines and consequences. 8 feet into the hill, he decided. Deep enough to let the earth do its work, shallow enough to avoid the groundwater table Maya had warned him about. The slope faced south, and Ethan took his time studying how the light moved across it during the day, where shadows lingered, where meltwater traced its preferred paths. He noted everything in the same notebook he had used in uniform. Pages creased and smudged, handwriting precise but unadorned. By the second morning, the sound of metal striking earth carried across the creek. It drew attention. The first visitor was Walt Dorsey again, trudging up the path with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. In daylight, the lines in his face looked deeper, as if the cold had etched them there deliberately. He stopped a few yards back and watched Ethan work without speaking. Walt had the posture of a man who understood leverage and patience, his weight always balanced, even at rest. "You're serious," Walt said finally. "Yes." Walt looked at the growing pile of excavated soil, at the clean angle of the cut. "Most folks start big and get sloppy," he said. "You're starting small and getting precise." Ethan didn't pause. "If it fails small." Walt huffed. It was almost approving. "Still think you're half burying yourself?" "Only half," Ethan said. Walt shook his head and spat into the snow. "If you need a come-along or timbers, I've got some old ones, not free." "I'll pay." "Didn't say you wouldn't." Walt turned to leave, then stopped. "You know why people don't like this kind of building?" "Why?" "Because it makes them look wasteful." Walt glanced back at the town below. "If you pull this off, a lot of folks are going to feel stupid." Ethan resumed digging. "They'll feel warm." Word spread faster than Ethan expected. Curiosity traveled light in winter. By the end of the week, a few neighbors had walked out to see the man carving into a hill with methodical stubbornness. Some offered advice he didn't ask for. Some offered warnings. One offered laughter. The laughter belonged to Caleb Hines, a man in his early 30s with a red beard and a permanently amused expression who ran a small contracting outfit in town. Caleb was built broad and square, the kind of man who took up space without noticing, and he wore his confidence like insulation. He stood at the edge of the cut, boots clean enough to signal he wasn't planning to stay long. "You know," Caleb said, "there's a reason we build above ground. People like windows, people like air." Ethan set down his shovel and looked up. "This will have both." Caleb grinned. "Sure, and I'm the governor." He gestured at the hill. "You're going to trap moisture, smoke, cold air. Nature doesn't care about clever ideas." Ethan wiped his gloves on his pants. "Nature cares about physics." Caleb laughed again, louder. "You military guys always think discipline fixes everything." Rook stood. Not aggressively, just enough to remind everyone present that space had meaning. Caleb's smile tightened. He lifted his hand slightly, mock surrender. "Hey, just saying. When you're cold, call me. I build real houses." When he left, Ethan returned to work without comment. The interruption barely registered. He had learned the difference between noise and information, and Caleb's words were mostly noise. Maya came the following afternoon. She parked at a distance and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching deliberately, as if announcing herself to both man and dog. She wore a knit cap pulled low over her ears, her dark hair escaping in loose strands, cheeks reddened by cold. She stopped at the edge of the excavation and crouched to examine the angle, her fingers brushing the soil. "You're keeping your lines clean," she said. "That matters more than people think." "I remember what you said about water," Ethan replied. "I'm sloping the floor toward the entrance, subtle, enough to move moisture." Maya nodded. "Good. And roof load?" "Timbers first, earth last." She studied his face, then the notebook lying open nearby. "You plan like someone who's had to think about failure in advance." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't improvise safety." Maya straightened. "I can get you access to reclaimed materials," she said. "Beams from a deconstructed warehouse. Treated. Still solid." "I'll pay." "Grant covers some of it," she replied. "The county likes experiments when they're framed as research." Ethan met her gaze. "I don't want this to be a spectacle." "It will be," Maya said calmly. "Better to guide how." That night the temperature dropped hard. Ethan finished the day's work with hands aching and muscles singing with fatigue. He ate from a tin by the fire pit, steam rising from the simple meal. Rook lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but tracking every sound. When the wind picked up, it rattled the pines and sent a low moan across the ridge. Ethan felt it in his chest, a vibration that tugged at old memories. He focused on the tangible, the heat of the fire, the solid presence of the dog, the cut in the hill that now looked less like a wound and more like an opening. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of corridors without doors, of orders that contradicted themselves, of voices speaking over one another. But he woke before dawn with his heart racing and the taste of iron in his mouth. Rook was already alert, muzzle pressed against Ethan's shoulder, steady pressure anchoring him. Ethan breathed until the dream receded. By the end of the second week, the excavation reached its planned depth. The space began to suggest a room rather than a hole. Ethan stood inside it and felt the difference immediately. The wind skimmed over the opening instead of cutting through him. The air was still, heavy in a way that promised stability. He struck a match and watched the flame. It burned straight. "This is right," he murmured. Rook sat beside him, ears forward, tail resting against the packed earth. Above them, winter gathered itself. Snow clouds moved in from the lake, thick and low. The town below prepared in its usual ways, stacking wood, sealing windows, bracing for a fight. Ethan looked at the hill he had broken and begun to shape, and for the first time since the letter arrived, he felt something like alignment. He wasn't hiding. He was building. The first timbers arrived under a sky the color of old tin. A flatbed truck crawled up the frozen track and stopped short of the cut, its engine ticking like a cooling animal. Ethan Crow signed the delivery receipt with a pen that kept skipping in the cold, then stood back as the driver lowered the beams one by one. They were reclaimed warehouse timbers, thick and straight, their surfaces scarred with bolt holes and oil-dark stains that spoke of another working life. Ethan ran a gloved hand along the grain and felt a quiet relief. Wood like this had already learned how to hold weight. He worked alone at first, setting the beams into place with measured patience, spacing them evenly, bracing them with temporary supports he'd cut himself. The rhythm of the work settled him. Measure, lift, set, check. Nothing rushed, nothing ornamental. Each decision had a reason, and each reason could be defended against weather and time. Rook stayed close, moving only when asked, his paws sure on packed earth and ice. The Malinois had taken to the site as if it were an assignment. 6 years old and still tireless, he watched the tree line, tracked the wind, and occasionally pressed his nose to the ground where something had passed hours earlier. His coat had thickened further, the tan deepening against the black of his face. When Ethan paused to catch his breath, Rook's tail tapped the earth once, a quiet check-in. By mid-morning, the sound of a second vehicle approached. It wasn't the heavy growl of a truck, but the steady hum of an older pickup. Ethan straightened as it pulled in and cut the engine. The man who climbed out moved with the careful economy of someone who knew his joints too well. He was in his late 50s, lean with a weathered face and steel-gray hair cropped short. A mustache sat heavy over his upper lip, and his eyes, dark, assessing, missed little. "Name's Frank Leland," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm without bravado. "Maya said you might need help setting roof loads." Ethan nodded. "I won't turn it down." Frank glanced at the beams, then at the cut in the hill. "You're doing this right," he said. "Most folks would have rushed to close it in." "What do you see?" Ethan asked. Frank crouched, squinting along the line of the timbers. "Spacing's good. Angle's right. You're letting the earth be a wall instead of pretending it isn't there." He straightened with a faint grunt. I was a mining engineer before I quit. 20 years underground changes how you think about pressure." "What made you quit?" Ethan asked. Frank's mouth tightened briefly. "Lost a man to a bad call I signed off on. Didn't want my name on decisions like that anymore." He shrugged once. "Now I consult when I can. Try to keep other people from learning the hard way." They worked together through the afternoon, Frank calling out adjustments, Ethan making them without argument. The collaboration felt natural. Two men who respected systems more than ego. When the last beam was seated, Frank stood back, hands on hips, and nodded. "This will hold," he said, "if you keep the moisture where it belongs." Moisture became the next enemy. The ground here was dry now, but Ethan knew that winter melt could turn patience into rot if ignored. He dug narrow channels at the base of the walls, filled them with gravel and perforated pipe, sloping everything toward the downhill side. He lined the interface with a vapor barrier, careful to leave room for air to move. It was tedious work, the kind that didn't look impressive from a distance, but Ethan took satisfaction in it. This was where houses failed quietly, months or years later, when no one was watching. As evening approached, Maya returned with a small crew and a stack of salvaged windows. They were mismatched, two tall and narrow, one squat and wide, but the glass was intact. Maya held one up to the light, her breath fogging it. "Set them deep," she said. "Light wells. You'll get sun without losing heat." "I know," Ethan replied. She studied him for a moment. "You don't say much," she observed. But you listen." He considered that. "Talking doesn't change load limits." She smiled faintly. "No, but it changes people. She set the window down carefully. "You're going to get attention once this is closed in." "I'm not building for attention." "Attention doesn't ask permission," Maya said. "Neither does winter." The first snow came that night, not a storm, just a quiet, steady fall that softened edges and filled footprints as soon as they were made. Ethan watched it from the tent entrance, mug of coffee warming his hands. The hill absorbed the sound, the flakes settling into the earth with barely a whisper. He imagined the space he'd carved, roofed now with timbers and canvas, the earth soon to be layered over it. He imagined stillness. The next morning, the town sent its skepticism in the form of curiosity. A few neighbors walked up, boots crunching, voices low. Among them was a woman named Ellen Price, a nurse in her 40s with tired eyes and hair pulled into a practical knot. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets studying the site. "My patients complain about cold more than pain," she said to Ethan, "especially the older ones. You really think this will stay warm?" "Yes," she nodded slowly. "If it does, people will want to know how." Ethan returned to work. He began stacking sod blocks cut from the upper slope, their roots woven tight, each one heavy and alive with memory. He set them in courses against the outer face, packing earth between layers, building mass rather than height. The work was brutal. His hands ached, his back burned, and his breath came sharp. But with each layer, the space inside grew quieter. The air held. That afternoon, a gust of wind tore across the ridge, rattling the pines and driving snow sideways. Ethan stepped inside the cut to secure a tarp and felt the difference immediately. Outside, the cold clawed. Inside, it dulled, blunted by earth and structure. He struck a match again, watching the flame. It wavered less than it had days before. Rook followed him in, shook snow from his coat, and lay down against the inner wall. His body heat warmed the packed earth, and the earth gave it back slowly. Ethan sat beside him for a moment, back against the wall, eyes closed. The quiet was profound, not empty, but full, like a held breath. By the end of the week, the roof was buried beneath the first layer of earth. From above, the structure nearly vanished, a subtle rise in the slope where none had been before. From within, it felt like being inside a held thought. The temperature stayed even. The wind passed overhead like a rumor. Ethan stood at the entrance at dusk, snow falling again, the town lights flickering on below. He wasn't finished, not even close, but the walls now remembered heat. They held it the way he'd hoped they would. He closed the door for the night, and the hill closed with him. The first real fire inside the hill was not a celebration. Ethan Crow treated it like a test he expected to fail if he grew careless. He waited until dusk, when the temperature slipped decisively below freezing and the wind leaned harder into the slope, then laid the kindling with deliberate restraint. No accelerants, no optimism, just dry splits, shaved thin, stacked to breathe. He struck the match and held it steady until the flame took, then withdrew his hand, as if the fire were a living thing that deserved space. The stove was small, cast iron, scarred from previous owners, heavy enough to bruise a shin if you forgot yourself. Frank Leland had helped him set it 2 days earlier, angling the flue to rise through the earth before emerging downwind of the ridge. The path of the pipe was a compromise between draft and safety, heat retention and escape. Frank had insisted on clearances that felt excessive until Ethan remembered why the man had quit mining. Excess had killed people. Rook watched from the packed earth floor, forelegs crossed, head resting between them. His eyes tracked the flame's reflection on the stove door. 6 years old, his muzzle still dark without the silver that came later, he radiated a calm that Ethan had come to rely on. When the stove popped softly as it warmed, Rook didn't flinch. He'd learned the difference between threat and noise. The heat built slowly, as Ethan intended. He moved through the space, checking seams with his bare hand, feeling for drafts. The inner walls, earth-faced, lined with vapor barrier and an air gap, gave back warmth like a delayed response. The temperature rose not in spikes, but in increments, as if the room were thinking about it before answering. Outside, the wind found nothing to complain about. It slid over the buried roof and moved on, disappointed. Ethan slept inside the cut for the first time that night. He didn't unpack everything. He laid his blanket near the inner wall, boots within reach, notebook under his head like a talisman. He woke twice, once from habit and once because the fire had settled and needed a small addition. Each time, the temperature held. When morning came, pale and unenthusiastic, the thermometer nailed to a post near the entrance read 58 degrees. Outside, the creek ice had thickened. Inside, the air felt patient. He allowed himself a single nod. The day brought complications. Snow turned to sleet by noon, a thin, needling rain that crept into seams and found edges. Ethan watched it bead and run along the entrance threshold, tracing the slope he'd built into the floor. The water moved where he had told it to go, disappearing into the gravel trench without argument. He crouched and listened, fingers pressed to the earth. No pooling, no seep. By mid-afternoon, a county truck pulled up, tires crunching, lights off. The man who stepped out wore a reflective jacket and a knit cap pulled low. He was in his early 40s, stocky, with a trimmed beard and a face that suggested he'd been skeptical since childhood. His name, he said, was Jonah Pike, and he worked inspections when people insisted on doing things their own way. Jonah took in the site with a practiced eye. "You're off-grid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "No utilities?" "No permit filed yet." "Not yet?" Jonah scribbled something on his clipboard. "I'm not here to shut you down," he said. "I'm here because someone called in a subterranean dwelling." His mouth twitched. "Not a phrase I hear often." Ethan gestured toward the entrance. "You can look." Inside, Jonah's skepticism adjusted. He felt the air, the walls, the steady warmth that didn't smell of smoke. He crouched by the stove, checked clearances, traced the flue's path with his eyes. He tested the door, noted the inward swing. His movements slowed, curiosity replacing reflex. "You planning on living here full-time?" Jonah asked. "Yes." Jonah straightened. "You'll need detectors, carbon monoxide, smoke, redundancy." "They're already installed," Ethan said, pointing. 2 small units blinked green in the half-light. Jonah nodded, a grudging respect settling in. "You've done your homework." "I don't like surprises," Ethan replied. Jonah made a note. "I'll file this as an experimental structure pending inspection after full enclosure." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, my grandparents had something like this in the Upper Peninsula. Earth walls, root cellar warmth. People forget." Ethan held his gaze. "I didn't." When Jonah left, the sky finally broke. The sleet thickened into heavy snow, falling straight down, muffling the world. By evening, the hill wore a clean white skin. From a distance, the structure vanished entirely, a rumor beneath the surface. That night, Ethan invited Maya and Frank to step inside, not to prove anything, just to share data. Maya arrived first, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright. Frank followed, carrying a small thermometer of his own, habit asserting itself. They stood shoulder to shoulder, feeling the stillness. "It's even," Maya said. "No hot spots, no drafts." Frank nodded. "The Earth's doing what it does best." They talked quietly, voices absorbed by the walls. Maya mentioned a neighbor, Ellen Price, who had asked about older patients struggling with heating bills. Frank spoke about pressure and patience, about how systems rewarded humility. Ethan listened. He added another split to the fire and watched the room accept it. Later, after they'd gone, Ethan stepped outside with Rook. Snow fell without wind now, thick and forgiving. The town lights below were dimmer, a few outages already visible. He imagined the night unfolding there, thermostats turned high, furnaces working overtime, wood stoves gulping fuel. Or he imagined the contrast. Rook trotted a short distance ahead and stopped, nose down. He stiffened, then relaxed. A deer had passed earlier, cautious and brief, life moving through winter because it knew how. Near midnight, the power went out across the valley. The town sank into a different darkness, one punctured by generators and candles. Ethan noticed only because the horizon changed. Inside the hill, nothing did. The temperature dipped a degree, then steadied. The walls held their memory. He sat with his back against the earth and let the quiet settle into him. The discharge letter, folded and refolded, lay in the notebook by his side. He didn't look at it. It had done its work already. Before sleeping, he checked the detectors once more, the flue, the door. He scratched Rook behind the ears. I felt the dog lean into it with a satisfied huff. The fire burned low and steady, not demanding, not dramatic. Outside, winter gathered its strength. Inside, the hill answered with calm. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. The lake went flat and metallic, the kind of stillness that made even seasoned locals uneasy. Radios carried clipped warnings between bursts of static. Temperatures were expected to plunge fast and stay there, driven by a pressure drop that bent weather maps into something almost personal. Ethan Crow listened, nodded once, and went back to work. He spent the morning reinforcing what could be reinforced and letting the rest be. Extra bracing at the entrance, a second latch on the door, fuel brought inside, stacked where it could dry and warm. He inventoried food with the same methodical calm he'd learned in uniform. Quantities, calories, margins. Rook followed him from task to task, a silent checklist with pause. The dog's coat had thickened into winter fullness now, his breath visible even inside when the door opened, his eyes alert without strain. 6 years old, he moved with practiced economy, saving energy for when it mattered. By midday, the wind returned, not loud yet, but persistent, worrying the ridge like a question that refused to be ignored. Snow began falling sideways, needles of ice that stung exposed skin. Ethan stood at the entrance and watched the hill accept it. The buried roof disappeared under white, contours smoothing until the structure was nothing more than a subtle rise in the land. From above, it would have looked like a mistake of geography. The first knock came before dark. It was not a polite knock. It was a fist against wood, hurried and uneven. Ethan opened the door and found Walt Dorsey standing there, his beard rimed with ice, eyes wide with a fear he hadn't bothered to hide. Behind him, half shadowed by blowing snow, stood a woman wrapped in 2 thin layers and a small shape clutched to her side. "Pipe froze," Walt said, words tumbling over each other. "Filled the house with smoke. I shut it down, but—" He gestured helplessly. "This is Marlene Jensen. Her truck slid off the road. She's got her boy." Marlene Jensen was in her late 20s, narrow-faced with windburned cheeks and blonde hair escaping from a loose braid. She held her son, a boy of about 8, close to her chest, his knit hat pulled low, eyes glassy with cold. Fear had made her movements precise and brittle. She didn't speak. She only nodded when Ethan stepped aside. "Bring them in," Ethan said. Inside, the air closed around them like a held breath. Marlene exhaled a sound that was half sob, but half disbelief. The boy shivered once, then leaned into her, already thawing. Rook moved closer, careful not to crowd, his presence steady and grounding. He sat where the boy could see him, tail resting on the earth, eyes soft. "Sit," Ethan said, and they did. He handed Marlene a mug, warm and heavy, and wrapped a blanket around the boy's shoulders. Walt stood awkwardly near the wall, hands flexing, pride stripped down to necessity. "Thank you," Marlene said finally, voice rough. "I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Ethan replied. The storm escalated quickly. By nightfall, the wind howled like an animal denied entry, battering the ridge with relentless force. Snow piled at the entrance, pressing, testing. Ethan checked the door seals, the detectors, the flue. The stove burned low and steady, like heat soaking into the walls, then returning it slowly. The temperature inside dipped only slightly, then stabilized. Another knock came an hour later. This time it was Ellen Price, the nurse, bundled in borrowed gear, her eyes sharp with concern. Behind her limped a man with a gray beard and a stoop that spoke of age and pain. His name was Harold Knox, she explained, a widower who lived alone in a drafty place closer to town. "He ran out of fuel," Ellen said. "I tried to get him to my place, but the roads—" Ethan waved them in without ceremony. He guided Harold to a seat near the wall, checked his hands for frostbite, nodded once when Ellen met his eyes. The room adjusted, not just in temperature but in tone. Voices lowered, movements slowed. The hill did its work. By midnight, the wind reached its peak. Power had been out for hours now, the valley below swallowed in darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a generator. Radio reports crackled with news of stalled cars, emergency shelters filling fast, response times stretched thin. Names began to circulate, people missing, people found too late. The cold was not abstract anymore. It was taking attendance. Ethan kept a log, not of fear, but of facts: fire consumption, interior temperature, air quality readings. He moved quietly among his guests, offering water, adjusting blankets, answering questions without embellishment. He did not tell anyone they were safe. He showed them instead. Marlene's son, whose name was Jacob, watched Rook with fascination. The dog accepted the attention with dignity, allowing a tentative hand to brush his shoulder, and then leaning just enough to reassure. Jacob smiled for the first time since arriving, the tension leaving his face in increments. "You live here?" Jacob asked Ethan. "Yes." "Under the ground?" "Partly." Jacob considered this. "That's smart," he said with the certainty of someone who had just felt cold and then not felt it. Walt stood near the entrance, staring at the wall as if it might answer him. His voice, when it came, was low. "My grandfather built something like this in Ontario. I forgot." He shook his head. "We all did." Outside, the storm raged for 2 full days. Snowdrifts climbed higher than fences. Roads vanished. The radio confirmed what Ethan already sensed: people were dying. Not in dramatic ways. In quiet houses where heat failed and time ran out. Inside the hill, life continued at a reduced, focused pace. But they ate simply. They slept in shifts. Ellen checked vitals. Ethan maintained systems. Rook patrolled the perimeter of the space, ears flicking at each sound, satisfied when the walls held. On the 3rd morning, the wind eased. The silence afterward felt almost loud. Ethan opened the door and found the world transformed, white and sculpted, drifts like frozen waves. The air burned the lungs. The thermometer outside read numbers that made the radio announcer pause before speaking them. Inside, it was 60 degrees. They stayed another day, waiting for plows and news. When it was safe, Walt left first, shoulders heavy with something like humility. Ellen took Harold back to town once roads cleared. Marlene hugged Ethan without asking, tears freezing on her lashes. "You saved us," she said. Ethan shook his head. "Yahat, the hill did." When the last of them were gone, the quiet returned. Not the lonely quiet of the motel room, but something earned. Ethan stood at the entrance with Rook, watching the sun catch on snow and turn it briefly gold. Down below, the town would tally losses and survivors, stories forming already. Here, the walls still held their memory. The town emerged from the storm with the stunned quiet of a place that had been struck hard enough to reconsider its habits. Plows chewed their way through drifts that had hardened overnight, leaving walls of snow like unfinished arguments along the roads. Smoke rose again from chimneys, thinner now, as if fuel were being rationed by instinct. Names traveled faster than facts: who had made it, who hadn't, where help had come from when the lights went out. Ethan Crow did not go looking for attention. He spent the morning after the last guests left, doing what he always did when uncertainty threatened to spread. He checked systems. He weighed the remaining fuel, measured interior temperature at 3 points, logged air quality readings, and noted how long the walls held heat after the fire burned down to coals. Rook followed him. Ears flicking, posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been before the storm. 6 years old and still sharp, the dog carried a new ease, as if the hill itself had given him permission to rest. By noon, tracks led up the slope again. Maya Hart arrived first, cheeks windburned, eyes alert with the contained urgency of someone who had seen too much need in too little time. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, felt the air, and closed her eyes for a second. "It's still even," she said, "after all that." "Yes," Ethan replied. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "I talked to the county," she said. "Emergency management wants numbers, not stories." "I have numbers." "I figured you would." She looked up, studying him. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" "Enough." She didn't push. By mid-afternoon, the small delegation formed, not a crowd, but a line. Walt Dorsey came again, hat in hand, his movements slower than usual. Behind him stood Caleb Hines, the contractor with the red beard, his confidence subdued into something like curiosity. Ellen Price arrived with a clipboard of her own, professional instinct overriding fatigue. Last was a man Ethan hadn't met yet, tall and narrow-shouldered, wearing a county jacket too light for the weather. His name was Samuel Reed. Samuel Reed was in his late 40s, clean-shaven, hair neatly parted despite the conditions. His eyes were tired in the way of someone who had been awake for responsibility rather than fear. He introduced himself as a regional coordinator for housing resilience, a title that suggested bureaucracy but carried the weight of recent failure. "I'm here to understand what happened," Samuel said, standing just inside the entrance. "And why?" Ethan didn't correct him. He handed over the notebook. Samuel took it carefully, as if it might be hot. He read in silence, lips moving slightly as he tracked figures. Temperatures, fuel consumption, time intervals. He looked up once, eyebrows lifting. "You're telling me this structure used a third of the fuel of nearby homes during the outage?" "Yes." "An interior temperature never dropped below 58. "Yes," Samuel nodded slowly. "That matches what people are saying." Caleb cleared his throat. He looked different without the grin, more angular, his red beard framing a mouth unused to admitting doubt. "I said some things," he began, then stopped. He tried again. "I didn't think this would work." Ethan met his eyes. "It's working," Caleb exhaled. "Yeah, I see that now." He gestured at the walls. "I build houses, good ones, but I watched my brother burn through his entire woodpile in 2 days. His kids slept in coats." He rubbed a hand over his beard. "I don't like being wrong, but I like that less." Walt spoke next, voice rough but steady. "My place lost heat twice, pipes cracked. I spent half the storm hauling snow off my roof and the other half apologizing to myself for not listening sooner." He looked at Ethan, not defensively, but squarely. "You didn't just build a house, you built a margin." Ellen nodded. "People with margins lived," she said simply. The conversation shifted then, from disbelief to logistics. Questions became specific. Could this be replicated? What about costs, time, training? Maya answered where she could. Ethan filled in gaps with data. Samuel took notes, his pen moving faster now. "We're not talking about replacing everything," Samuel said finally, "but we can't ignore this." He gestured at the walls. "Not after the numbers." Ethan closed the notebook. "I'm not interested in selling a miracle." Samuel looked relieved. "Good, because miracles don't scale." He paused. "Would you be willing to consult? Not for press, for process." Ethan considered. He thought of the motel room, the letter, the way the wind had once found every weakness. He thought of Jacob's certainty when he'd said, "That's smart." He nodded once. "If it keeps people warm." "It will," Samuel said, "if we do it right." After they left, the hill felt quieter than it had since the storm. Ethan and Rook stepped outside. The sky was clear now, a hard blue that made the cold honest. Below them, the town moved again, slowly, cautiously, but moving. Rook trotted ahead, nose to the snow, then stopped. He stiffened, ears forward, and let out a single low huff. A deer stood at the edge of the trees, watching. It was thin, winter sharp, eyes bright with the calculus of survival. After a moment, it bounded away, hooves flashing. Ethan watched it go. He understood the arithmetic. That evening, Maya returned alone. She brought bread and a jar of preserves, set them on the small table without comment. "I'm not here as the county," she said. "I'm here as someone who wants this to be done well." Ethan poured coffee. "It has to be." She leaned against the wall, feeling its warmth. "You know they'll try to turn this into a headline." "I won't," she smiled. That might be the most convincing argument." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the temperature dropped again, but the walls answered with patience. Inside, the fire burned low, steady, content to be part of a system rather than its center. Before sleeping, Ethan added a final note to the log. Community interest rising. Data consistent. Systems stable. He closed the notebook and set it aside. Rook curled near the wall, sighing as he settled. Ethan lay back and listened to the quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of balance. Tomorrow there would be plans, meetings, replications, arguments about cost and code. Tonight there was proof. The hill had kept its promise, the numbers had spoken. And for the first time since the letter, Ethan felt something loosen inside him, not triumph, but trust. Spring arrived in Duluth the way it always did, reluctant, incremental, testing the patience of anyone who tried to rush it. Snow retreated in patches rather than surrendering outright, and the creek below the ridge began to speak again, a low, persistent sound that threaded through the days. The hill kept its shape. Where winter had pressed, the earth relaxed without forgetting. Ethan Crow did not mark the season with ceremony. He marked it with measurements. He tracked how the interior temperature lagged behind the thaw, how the walls absorbed the sun and returned it at night, how moisture moved and never lingered. The structure was finished now, not polished, not decorative, but complete in the way a tool was complete when it did its job without complaint. 2 deep-set windows caught the morning light and delivered it gently. The door opened inward, heavy and honest. The stove burned less and less, its presence becoming supplemental rather than central. Rook adjusted before Ethan did. The Malinois shed his winter coat in clumps that floated like dandelion fluff, revealing muscle and scar beneath. 6 years old, still quick. He spent more time sprawled on the packed earth floor near the doorway, eyes half-lidded, ears tracking the outside world with lazy precision. He had learned that the hill did not need guarding the way tents and temporary places did. It stayed. The first build consultation happened quietly. No flyers, no cameras. Just a pickup pulling up the ridge road and stopping with deliberate care. The man who stepped out was named Thomas Vale, early 50s, narrow-faced with a salt and pepper beard and the posture of someone whose work had once been purely physical. He'd lost his job at the paper mill the year before and had stayed because leaving cost more than enduring. "I don't need a showpiece," Thomas said, standing with his hands jammed into his pockets. "I need something that won't eat my savings." Ethan walked him through the site, explaining only what mattered: orientation, drainage, load paths, thermal mass. He showed him numbers, not promises. Thomas listened, nodding once or twice, eyes narrowing when something made sense. "I can help," Thomas said finally. "I still know how to work." "That's enough," Ethan replied. Word moved the way it always did in small towns, sideways and then outward. By early summer, Ethan found himself standing on 3 different slopes in 3 different parts of the county, notebook in hand, Rook nearby, explaining the same principles to different faces. He charged a modest fee for consultations and nothing for advice. Maya handled permits and translations into code language. Caleb Hines sent 2 of his crew to help on a build and didn't make jokes anymore. Walt Dorsey dug into his own hillside and pretended it had always been the plan. The work changed Ethan without softening him. He spoke more, but only when necessary. He listened better. The anger that had once held him upright loosened into something sturdier, purpose without performance. He slept through the night more often. When dreams came, they stayed manageable. One afternoon, as the ground warmed enough to smell alive again, a woman arrived on horseback. Her name was Laura Bennett, late 30s, tall and weather-fit, with a sun-browned face and eyes that had learned patience from distance. She wore a faded jacket and rode a bay gelding that moved with the steady confidence of a creature that had carried weight without resentment. The horse, named Alder, was 12 years old, scarred at the flank from a long-ago mishap and calm to the point of indifference. "I heard you build places that don't argue with winter," Laura said, swinging down easily. "I run a small equine therapy program. The barn's fine. The people aren't always." Ethan listened. He watched Alder's ears flick and settle. He watched Rook sit at a respectful distance, eyes curious but unchallenging. "Tell me about the land," he said. They walked. They talked. They sketched lines that would become something quiet and resilient. Laura didn't ask about Ethan's past. She asked about soil. By autumn, the ridge had company, not clutter, but kin. 3 earth-sheltered homes stood at respectful distances, each adapted to its slope, each carrying the same logic in different bodies. None of them looked alike. All of them worked. Children played on roofs without knowing it. Gardens tucked into south-facing cuts grew longer into the season than anyone expected. Fuel piles stayed full. The county filed a report. It was dry, factual, and devastating to old assumptions. Emergency fuel use dropped in the pocket of hills where the builds clustered. Medical visits for cold exposure declined. The numbers did not argue. They informed. A small ceremony happened without being planned. On a clear October evening, neighbors gathered at the ridge, not to praise but to share. Ellen brought soup. Walt brought bread. Thomas brought his hands, still calloused. Laura arrived with Alder, who accepted a child's hug without fuss. Someone handed Ethan a plaque they had made at the hardware store. It read simply, "Thank you for the margin." Ethan didn't know what to say. He cleared his throat and didn't say anything. Rook accepted a biscuit and lay down, satisfied. Later, when the fire burned low and people drifted home, Ethan stood at the entrance of his place and watched the stars emerge. The lake reflected nothing now, dark and vast, its power unchanged. He thought of the letter, how it had once felt like an ending. He thought of the hill, how it had taught him otherwise. Laura lingered, hands in her pockets. "You know," she said, "places like this do something to people." "What?" Ethan asked. "They let you stop bracing." He nodded. That felt right. Winter returned, as it always would, but it arrived differently now, less as a threat, more as a condition to be met. The walls remembered heat, the ground held, the systems did what they were meant to do. When the cold pressed, it found resistance that did not need to shout. On the first night of real snow, Ethan wrote one last line in the notebook and closed it for good. Built to stay. Built to share. Rook curled by the wall, breathing slow and deep. Outside, flakes settled into the shapes of things that would last. The hill kept its promise, and so did the man who had learned to trust it. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, hidden in patience, in wisdom, in hands willing to work with the world God already gave us. This story was never just about a house in the earth. It was about a man who was cast aside, yet refused to become bitter. About a loyal animal who never abandoned him, about choosing faith over fear, preparation over panic, humility over pride. Maybe God didn't stop the storm, but he gave knowledge, he gave resilience, he gave a way to endure when the cold came. In our daily lives, we may not face blizzards or frozen nights, but we face losses, rejection, loneliness, and moments where the world tells us we no longer belong. And in those moments, perhaps the miracle is not escape, but the strength to build something steady, something kind, something that protects others. If this story gave you hope, if it reminded you that no person, no child, and no animal should ever face fear alone, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because your voice matters here. And if you believe in quiet miracles, in second chances, and in faith that shows itself through action, subscribe to this channel so these stories can continue to reach those who need them. May God bless you, protect your home, warm your nights, and guide you gently through every season you face. Amen.